Welcome back to Saruwatari Xtreme. Race car technology is moving down to supercars at a rapid rate, which is great for enthusiasts like ourselves because we can use this developed technology in speccing our own cars. One of my favorite features is center lock wheels, but this is highly debatable because a lot of people actually don't like center lock wheels because of the difficulties in pulling the wheel off and on. Today we'll go over the process. I'll go over the tools that are necessary and show you exactly how to do it. This way you can go ahead and make your own decision of whether or not it's worth it for you. Before you start the job, it's a good idea to inventory the tools and supplies you'll need. The first thing you'll need is the Castrol Mollab Alloy Paste TA. It's important to source this early because at least I haven't been able to find them in any local parts houses. Where I get it from is actually the Porsche dealer. In the car, you should find a tool. The tool will have one end to pull the center cap, and the other end will be to adjust the locking mechanism. In that same location, the adapter for the center lock nut can be found. Two large items you'll need is one, a 3/4 inch breaker bar. I use a 1 inch to 3/4 inch adapter because oftentimes I have to actually use a cheater pipe. They sell collapsible units. They come in cases, perfect if you're traveling to put in your vehicle. The second big item you'll need is a 3/4 inch torque wrench. The center lock nuts need to be torqued down to 443 pounds, so there's plenty of length and leverage to do the job with one of these. If you feel the need, you can buy them off the Snap-on truck, but it will be quite pricey. Or you can follow my path. I source these off of Amazon. They're American made. I haven't had a problem. I don't use them a lot, but they've held up just fine. So once you have all this stuff set, there is one other important component you'll need to do the job, and that is an assistant. Almost every time I have to brake the nuts, I need somebody to sit in the vehicle and push on the brake pedal, just to plan ahead, of course. And there you go. The first thing we want to do is take the tool and use the end that looks almost like a screwdriver. Look at the nut carefully. You'll find a notch. In the notch, you'll take the tool and gently pry out the center cap. Once the center cap's out, that exposes the spline inside the nut along with the lock. I have around 3/4 of the weight loading the suspension, and I'll use an assistant in the car applying the brakes. The reason why I don't put 100% of the weight on the suspension is when the nut cracks, it can actually push the wheel out so it's not flat against the hub. We have our breaker bar. We'll use the socket for the center lock with the spline, and this right here releases the lock on the nut to the spline. So we're going to go ahead and put it on. Now I went ahead and broke this already with the cheater bar, but it's still on tight. Okay? So when you put it on to the nut, you want to just make sure it's completely flush down. If it's not, it will damage the lock to the spline, which is very bad times. Once you're down completely flush, use one arm and keep leaning into it so it stays onto the nut. You can see it wants to come off right there. Come out to the very end where you have the most leverage and lean in. And then once you break it, you want to go ahead and come back 1/8 to no more of 1/4 of a turn back. Again, of course, because that could possibly allow the wheel to move. Now we're ready to go up. The front lift points are fairly easy to identify. There are these rectangular aluminum plates located behind the front wheels. These are the lift points for the monocoque. The rear is not as straightforward. In front of the rear tires and inboard, there are rectangular cutouts in the under trays. These allow access to the rear lift points. The issue is that it is actually recessed into the under tray. So you'll need some sort of spacer to actually lift the car. What I used was a 1x4 wood block that is 2¼ inches wide. That went up into the hole and went between the lift point and the lift pad. This allowed me to lift it up without damaging the under trays. Anything of that dimension will work as well. We are ready now to send up the rotary lift. Now we can take the center lock socket, and even by hand, once we release the lock, we can turn the nut out. If the nut won't go, just use the breaker bar and pull it back just a little bit more. Slowly bring the nut out. Once the center lock nut is off, we can really get a good look at the inner workings of what's going on. These are the splines we see that are on the nut. They mate right here to these splines, which are the lock. It's depressed by the tool. It's very important when it goes together that the spline is flush with the spline on the nut. If not, it is possible that the nut can actually back off. Right here we can see the tapered cone that mates to the wheel and also centers it. And here are the threads on the nut that thread into the hub. And you can see right here that we've used a Xtreme mall loop paste right on this to assemble. Now we are ready to carefully pull back the wheel. Once the wheel's off, we get a real clear view of the inner workings of the center lock. Instead of the stud lug or a lug nut, it just has the equivalent of these tapered guide studs that the wheel comes down, mates against, and the nut itself just holds it firmly in position. We're ready to send the wheel back up. We just want to make sure that the flange on the wheel and the mating flange on the rotor is clean of debris. Now we can take the nut and just use a little bit of paste on the brush, and you want to just get it on the threads and use a very, very light coat. If you get any in any other location, you want to just go ahead and wipe that off, and then we're ready to put the nut on. I like to also put a thin layer of oil on the O-ring just so it doesn't get caught. And you just barely start the nut by hand, and you want to use a tool, because if you try and spin it on very far by hand, it's going to run right into the lock. Then take the breaker bar and just snug it down while it's up in the air. As we're coming down and the suspension is lightly loaded, we'll grab the 3/4 inch torque wrench and the center lock nut adapter. What the owner's manual calls for is an initial torque of 89 foot-pounds. I already did this as it was coming down, so now I have the suspension loaded. I've grabbed my assistant, who will push on the brakes and hold the steering wheel. This way we can go ahead and go to a final torque of 443 foot-pounds. When you torque, you obviously have two options. You can either push the wrench down or lift the wrench up. I prefer to lift the wrench up for control. If you're going down and you have all your weight into it and you slip, there's always a greater chance of damaging the car. So we take the torque wrench, the nut, adapter, mount it flush, then slightly load it, work your way out to the end of the torque wrench for the most torque, then just go ahead and give it a hard pull until she snaps. Right there, we hit 443 foot-pounds. Carefully pull everything off. And we're set to adjust the lock for the nut. On the opposite end of the tool that was used to remove the center cap, you'll find this key. This key is to adjust the lock that mates to the splines on the nut of the center lock. All the stories you hear about center locks coming off, this is where things get very critical. That lock inside the nut needs to be flush with the outer edge of the splines. If it's not, the nut can back off. Once the lock is in place in the splines, the nut itself cannot come off. That's why this is such an important step. The last thing we need to do is pop back in the center cap. As you can see, pulling the wheels off and on with the center lock system isn't insanely difficult. The difficult part is having the tooling. When I take a long trip, I'll take the tools with me, which to most of you is going to seem like a major hassle. But for me, I view it as part of the deal with owning and driving these type of vehicles. If you're a long way from home or the shop you like to use that has the tooling, there are other options. Many of the Lambo models have center lock. They've got the tooling. Also, Porsche dealers, a huge resource because they're more plentiful, and the GT cars all have center lock. So in your car, you should of course have the tool to remove the center cap and adjust the locking mechanism for the nut. Then there's adapter to pull the nut, of course. So all you would need is them to use their tooling. That way they could pull off the wheel. You could either have the tire repaired or replaced, put it back together, and you're all set to go. The center lock system on the SV was $4,200. For me, completely worth it, solely based on that I love the visual appearance of the center lock. Then above that, you get the race car technology or heritage, the slight weight savings, and the exclusivity. All these together are just a package that I can't pass up. However, there are a lot of enthusiasts that don't like the center lock system because of the issues that we've talked about. One thing to consider is, though, when these cars go to the used market, there's so few of them, and oftentimes buyers are looking specifically for the latest technology, like carbon ceramic brakes or center locks. Your car could be at a disadvantage if you're going to sell it and try and get into something new. Just something to think about. I hope all this information helps you, and I'll see you next time.